What is up, people on the interwebs? I hope you are having a creepy day for this spooky month, and we are back with another video. Today we are going to talk about a fairly popular British folklore, and that is the Screaming Skulls. Legend says that people become so attached to a certain area that they never want to leave. They want to become part of the surrounding area. They want some part of their earthly body to stay attached to the area around them, and most times it's their head that stays behind. Legend says that if you remove one of these skulls from their sacred location that they never wish to leave, paranormal activity will start to happen and a blood-curdling scream will be heard until the skull is returned back to its sacred location. It has also been said to whoever moves the skull from their sacred location will be cursed forever, and it may even cause an untimely death to the person who moved the skull. So today we are going to explore 3 of the most terrifying Screaming Skull legends around the United Kingdom. But of course, let's bring on the spooky atmosphere and let's dive straight on in to these British folklores about Screaming Skulls. Number 1. Anne Griffiths, based in the Burton Angus Hall in Yorkshire. Burton Angus Hall was built during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I by 3 sisters named Frances, Margaret and Anne, the daughters of Sir Henry Griffiths. Just before the hall was completed, the youngest daughter, Anne, was returning from a family trip to the nearby village. She was attacked and left for dead by a group of ruffians. Brought back to her beloved home, her dying wish was that her body would remain part of the hall forever. She made her sisters promise that her head would be removed from her body and her head remain in the hall forever. However, unsurprisingly, Anne's sisters did not keep her promise, and they buried her intact in the local churchyard. Shortly after, strange things began to happen. The hall was plagued by strange sounds and moans, and poltergeist activity erupted through the halls every night. The family were terrified and recalled the broken promise to Anne. They decided to make amends. The sisters visited the family vault in order to keep their sister's deathbed request. The coffin was opened, and what they found inside shocked them straight to the bone. Although her body was well preserved, they found that her head was now detached from her body and bare of all its flesh. Only a bare skull remained. Anne finally got her wish, and her skull was placed upon a table in her beloved hall. Peace fell upon the hall once again. Well, for the most part, as many servants did not believe in the legend of Anne's skull, and one servant threw her skull on a bypassing horse and wagon, where upon contact the horse reared in fear and pictures were flying off the walls in the grand hall, and a blood-curdling scream was heard. Eventually, Anne's skull was returned back to her beloved hall. Anne's skull was bricked up within one of the walls somewhere in the house for safety. It is said that you may actually see Anne's apparition still walk among the halls in the month of October, as that was the month where she met her demise. And it has also been said that you can feel her presence, especially in the Queen's chamber in Burton Angus Hall to this very day. Definitely a creepy tale. I can completely see why they bricked up her skull within one of the walls, so no one would ever be tempted to remove her skull from the house. You can clearly see this is where she wanted to remain forever and ever. Moving on to the next creepy Screaming Skull folklore. So our next Screaming Skull legend is based in Chiltern Farm in Yeovil, Somerset. During the English Civil War, philosopher Brom was a proud royalist. However, he became so appalled how the king's troops were treating prisoners, he abandoned his royalist view and he defected to the Roundhead side. And the Roundheads were a group of people who did not want kings and queens to be in charge of a country's executive decisions. They wanted the country's executive decisions to be based on a parliament base, similar to what the UK is now, where Parliament is one of the main controlling parts to decide how a country is run. After the end of the Civil War, the Roundheads lost and Charlie II returned to the throne. Philosophist Brom decided to live a quiet and peaceful life on the Chiltern farm with his sister, but he feared upon his death that the king would want revenge, as he was petrified that when he died, his head would be cut off and put on display to the public to show the world that he was a traitor to the king. Therefore, on his dying wish, he made his sister promise that when he died, that his skull would be preserved in the house for all eternity. The sister agreed to his dying wish, and on the day of his death, his sister removed his head from his body and she placed his head somewhere within the house. Eventually, his sister died and many tenants moved into Chiltern Farm. Many attempts were made to dispose of the skull from the house, but whenever this was done, a most terrifying and frightening and blood-curdling scream came emanating from the skull. Not to mention, it also brought a huge amount of paranormal activity within the house. But once the tenants returned the skull back into the property, the blood-curdling screams stopped and all the paranormal activity halted within the house. The skull now abides in its own special cabinet over one of the doors in the Grand Hall of Chiltern Farm. There is some truth to this legend, as Philosophist Brom is buried in the local church near Chiltern Farm, and a few years back the church had some restoration work being done, and one of the restoration crew decided to open up Philosophist Brom's coffin, and all that remained in the coffins were just the skeleton of his body, and there was no head to be seen within the coffin. Definitely another creepy tale, and all I'm learning from all these tales is if you see a skull in a house, leave it where it rests, because all from it sounds, if you move one of these skulls, a lot of bad and spooky stuff happens. We are now moving on to our final Screaming Skull legend, and this one is based in Beetlecombe Manor in Dorset. Beetlecombe Manor is the ancestral home of Azriah Penny. Legend says that Ariane Penny was meant to be hanged and quartered in France in his failed attempt to overtake the monarch in 1685. This was in line with the English Civil War that was going on within the times. Somehow he managed to make his return back to England, but on his return he somehow managed to take back with him a slave. The slave was used to hot tropical climates and he could not cope with the kind of dark, cold, windy, wet weather Dorset had, and eventually he was soon on his deathbed. His dying wish to Azriah Penny was that his body was shipped back to his native land so his bones could be buried at peace, and he also stated if his body was not returned back to his native land, there would be great consequences that would be coming within the house. Eventually the slave died, and Azriah Penny did not want to waste all that money to return a slave back to his native land, because obviously in that time a slave had no meaning worth, and they were not going to waste all that money to make a slave's wish come true. So his body was buried in the local churchyard. Soon the dark chambers of Beetlecombe Manor echoed with a blood-curdling scream throughout the halls. There were terrifying moans and groans coming through every bellow of the hallway in Beetlecombe Manor, and the strongest groans and moans were emanating from the slave's burial site. Azriah was forced to dig up the slave's bones, and for the meantime he brought the slave's bones back into the house and he stored them in one of the chimneys up in the attic. For a while the house became silent again and peace seemed to restore back to Beetlecombe Manor. Over time the body crumbled into nothing, and all that was left was the skull of the slave hidden away in the chimney up in the attic. Many attempts had been made to move the skull from the attic. The skull had been thrown into a nearby pond, but the second the skull was thrown into the pond, the blood-curdling screams returned to Beetlecoombe Manor and much more paranormal activity began to happen. With the blood-curdling screams returning, they dredged the pond until they could find the skull, and they returned the skull back to the attic. Once they returned the skull back to the attic, peace returned to Beetlecoombe Manor. Should anyone be foolish to remove the skull from its favourite resting place, the screams will return, and it will also cause agricultural damage. And the person who removes the skull, it has also been said that he will die within the year from a blood-curdling and agonising death. But there you guys have it. Let's remove the spooky atmosphere. Those were some of the most creepiest screaming skull legends based around the UK. My homeland definitely has some creepy legends about skulls. There's definitely many other screaming skull legends. I know there's a screaming skull legend based around a pub, as there was a huge documentary about it years ago. But what did you guys think? Did you enjoy hearing all these creepy legends of screaming skulls based in the UK? If you did, leave it a comment and a like. And just remember guys, keep being spooky, keep being amazing, and I'll see you tomorrow for another spooky video. Bye!